She parked like she owned the street. Twice a week. Front bumper practically kissing my mailbox. I circled, I sighed, I took pictures. She smiled at me like I was interrupting her throne. That's when I decided this wasn't annoyance anymore. It was a problem that needed an answer. I started small. A note on the windshield that read like a question, not an accusation. No response. A polite email to the HOA with timestamps and photos. The HOA promised to look into it. 2 weeks later, nothing changed. Her SUV still ate my morning exit. My patience shrank overnight. So I changed the game. I documented everything, dates, times, exact positions. I asked neighbors if they'd seen the same behavior. They had. They were tired too. Suddenly my little complaint looked less like a grumpy neighbor issue and more like a pattern. Patterns are easier to fix than moods. I brought evidence to the next HOA meeting. I spoke calmly. I showed the photos. I read the log. Faces in the room shifted from polite indifference to awkward recognition. The board remembered their bylaws for exactly this kind of thing. Words in a binder began to matter. When the board took action, it didn't look like revenge. It looked like paperwork. Notices were mailed. Warnings were filed. The language was dry, but the effect was loud. She ignored the notices. That's when the HOA called the tow company, not me, not my idea, the association's enforcement process. The tow truck arrived on a Tuesday morning. Her car left on a flatbed. The cul-de-sac hummed with the sound of someone else's rules being enforced. People asked if I felt guilty. I didn't. I felt relieved. I felt the little victory of getting my driveway back without breaking anything or starting a fight. I also learned that systems, boring, procedural systems, are the secret weapon when personalities clash. You don't need drama. You need records. But making her car disappear wasn't about disappearance at all. It was about making the nuisance stop and making the consequence real. It was about neighbors realizing they could organize. It was about teaching a stubborn person that actions have administrative consequences. And it changed the mood on our street. The next morning, someone waved at me as I pulled out. A small, conspiratorial wave. The HOA board members finally smiled without checking their phones. Life felt lighter. Of course, not every story ends cleanly. Karen didn't vanish forever. She showed up at the next meeting, red-faced and loud. She had a stack of paperwork of her own. She wanted her car back. She wanted apologies. The room smelled like coffee and tension. She blamed me. She blamed the board. She blamed the tow truck driver. I listened. I kept my voice even. I offered facts, not fury. But her next move surprised everyone, and that's when I realized the real trick I'd pulled was not the towing at all. It was how I'd turned isolation into community pressure. What she did next made me rethink everything I thought I knew about neighborhood warfare. She filed an appeal that opened a door I didn't expect. And somewhere between the appeal and the emergency meeting I found myself thinking about escalation, about reputation, about the line between standing up and stoking a fire, and then she slammed a thick binder onto the table. It wasn't just an appeal. It was a dossier. Pages of highlighted bylaws, clipped sections of the HOA's own rules, even grainy cell phone pictures she had clearly been saving. She leaned into the microphone like a prosecutor and declared the board had overstepped. According to her, the tow was illegal, the fine was unjust, and every single neighbor who complained was part of a conspiracy against her. The room went still. Some people looked down at their coffee cups, others at me. I didn't flinch. I knew she wasn't just fighting for her car, she was fighting to win back control. Her voice cracked, not from weakness but from the weight of her obsession. She recited page numbers like scripture. Every sentence carried the same accusation. You tried to take me down and I'm not going quietly. The board president tried to steer the meeting back to order, but she kept going louder, faster, waving those papers like weapons. That's when I noticed something. Her evidence wasn't airtight. She was quoting rules that didn't exist anymore. Outdated clauses. Revisions that had been replaced years ago. She thought she had the system on her side, but the system had moved on without her. I raised my hand slowly. The president nodded. I stood up and, instead of arguing with her, I asked a question. Karen, which edition of the bylaws are you citing? She blinked. I asked again calmly. She shuffled papers. The room leaned forward. And in that silence, I knew I had her cornered. Not with anger, not with noise, but with precision. She sputtered something about the official rules, and waved another sheet, but the board attorney spoke up for the first time. He confirmed those sections were outdated. Karen froze. Her binder, her so-called weapon, had just turned into dead paper. But she didn't sit down. She wasn't done. If anything, being caught in that moment only fueled her. She switched tactics, abandoning bylaws and going for personal attacks. My name came up, my house, even my job. She tried to make me the villain, the neighbor who had orchestrated the whole thing. And as her words echoed through the room, I realized this wasn't just about a car anymore. It was about her needing to win at any cost. The board president tapped the gavel, trying to calm her down. But then Karen leaned forward, looked directly at me, and said something that made every head in that room turn. She threatened to, "Make sure you regret ever messing with me." The words dropped heavy in the room. A few neighbors gasped, others whispered. The board president's eyes widened. The attorney immediately leaned into his mic, reminding her that threats would be recorded in the minutes. But Karen didn't care. She crossed her arms, lips tight, daring anyone to challenge her. I stayed seated. No reaction, no outburst. I'd already learned that silence can be louder than shouting. The board members exchanged glances and one of them scribbled something down. I knew what that meant. Her own behavior was becoming evidence, the kind she couldn't erase. Then came the twist. Instead of backing down, she doubled down. She said if her car could be towed, then so could anyone's. She accused the board of targeting her unfairly while ignoring other violations. She named names. She pointed to parked cars outside the meeting hall. Suddenly, people who had been neutral started shifting uncomfortably in their seats. She was trying to pull everyone into the fire with her. But here's the part that shocked me, she wasn't entirely wrong. There were other minor violations around the neighborhood. Trash bins left out too long, cars sticking over curbs, lawns not trimmed. Most of us never thought much about it, but Karen weaponized those little details. She dragged them into the spotlight, turning neighbors against neighbors, stirring tension like it was her second language. The meeting unraveled fast. Voices rose, neighbors argued, and the board struggled to keep order. Karen thrived in the chaos, almost smiling as the room fractured. That's when I realized, this wasn't about her car at all. It was about control, about proving she could bend the neighborhood to her will, even if it meant burning everything down in the process. And just when it looked like the board was losing grip, the HOA attorney cleared his throat and calmly announced something that flipped the mood like a switch. He revealed that Karen's history with the HOA wasn't as invisible as she thought. He had records, letters, previous warnings, and one document that explained exactly why her car disappearing this time was different from all the others. Karen's face drained of color as he pulled out the file. Neighbors leaned forward, whispering. My pulse quickened. I had no idea what was coming next, but I could tell it wasn't just about parking anymore. This was deeper, older, something the rest of us hadn't been told. And when he began to read aloud the first line of that document, the room fell into a silence so sharp you could hear every nervous breath. This resident has been under probationary review since. The year he read out made everyone blink. It wasn't recent. It was years ago, long before I ever moved into the neighborhood. Karen had a history, a long one with the HOA. Noise complaints, landscaping violations, unpaid fines that had piled up like dust in an attic. But the one that stood out, the one that made the room tighten, was a documented incident involving another neighbor's car, nearly identical to mine. She had blocked a driveway before. She had been warned before. She had even been towed before. This wasn't new behavior, it was a cycle. And suddenly, all the heat she had tried to direct at me didn't matter anymore. The story wasn't me versus her, it was her versus everyone for years. Karen shifted in her seat, her face red but her voice louder, insisting those past incidents had been personal vendettas. She said neighbors had always targeted her because she spoke her mind. But the weight of her history made her defense sound hollow. People who once sat quietly now started muttering openly. Some nodded. Some shook their heads. But nobody looked convinced anymore. The attorney closed the folder and set it on the table like a gavel. The board president leaned forward, finally steady again, and said, Karen, this isn't about a single car anymore. This is about a repeated disregard for your neighbors and the community rules. Her mouth opened to fire back, but for the first time since I'd known her, Karen hesitated. That split second of silence told me something. The armor she wore, her binder, her bluster, her threats, was cracking. And then the board president announced the part nobody expected. They weren't just considering fines or another tow. They were preparing a motion for something far more permanent. Karen's residency privileges within the HOA itself were now on the table. If passed, it would strip her of voting rights, impose escalating penalties, and potentially put a lien on her property if she refused to comply. The room erupted again. Neighbors whispered like they'd just witnessed the opening move of a chess match they hadn't realized they were part of. Karen slammed her fist down, rattling the microphone, and shouted that this was harassment, that the entire board was corrupt. She pointed at me again, spitting out accusations that I had plotted this from the start. But as she raged, I noticed something subtle. Some of the very neighbors she had tried to rally with her earlier were now sliding their chairs back, distancing themselves. They weren't buying it anymore. She was losing her audience. Still, Karen wasn't finished. Her voice cut through the noise as she made one last, desperate declaration. If they went through with this motion, she would take the fight beyond the HOA. She claimed she had contacts, lawyers, even reporters. She promised she would make the story public, that she would drag the entire neighborhood into the spotlight whether we liked it or not. And as those words echoed in the hall, I felt a chill crawl up my spine, not because of her threat itself but because of the way some neighbors reacted. A few of them didn't look afraid of her, they looked curious, almost intrigued. That was the moment I realized Karen might have just stumbled onto a new weapon, one that could shift the entire battle from our little cul-de-sac to a stage much bigger than any of us expected. Because once the word reporters left her lips, the atmosphere in that hall shifted. Not toward sympathy, not toward outrage, but toward fear of exposure. Nobody likes their quiet suburban street turned into a headline. Nobody wants their name showing up in some clickbait article about feuding neighbors and petty wars. The idea that Karen might drag our problems out of the shadows and into the media suddenly made everyone stiffen in their seats. The board president tried to keep composure, insisting the HOA had nothing to hide. But his voice betrayed a tiny tremor. Neighbors who'd been nodding confidently before now whispered to each other with darting eyes. If Karen had even the smallest thread of proof, or if she spun the story just right, our neighborhood could be painted as the villain. And everyone knew perception mattered more than truth in a headline. Karen saw it too. For the first time that night, she smirked, her confidence creeping back. She leaned into the microphone, savoring every second. "You think you can silence me? Try. I'll make sure every paper, every local station hears what really happens here. You'll all be famous." Her words dripped with mockery, but underneath there was calculation. She wasn't just bluffing, she was testing us, watching who shifted, who looked nervous. It was a move designed to fracture us further, to make allies out of anyone too afraid of the spotlight. And from the way a few neighbors avoided her gaze, I knew she'd hooked someone. That's when the HOA attorney leaned back in his chair, calm, almost amused. He reminded Karen, slowly, clearly, that going public would also mean her history became public record. Every warning, every unpaid fine, every tow notice, documented, time-stamped, undeniable. If she wanted to invite reporters, she'd also be inviting her own skeletons to dance under the lights. The smirk faltered. For a split second, her eyes narrowed, weighing the threat against the risk. She didn't back down, but she didn't press forward either. The room waited, holding its breath. And then, instead of addressing the board, Karen turned to the neighbors directly. She bypassed the table of authority and aimed her voice at the crowd, raw and unfiltered. "You think this is about me? It's not. It's about them. The board controls everything, what you can plant, where you can park, how you live. Today it's my car. Tomorrow it's your house. Wake up before it's too late." Her words hit differently. It wasn't the usual Karen tantrum, it was almost persuasive. People shifted again, not out of annoyance but out of thought. She was trying to rally them, to turn the HOA from protector into oppressor in their eyes. And for the first time, I saw uncertainty spread across faces that had been firmly against her. That's when I realized the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. Karen wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was planting seeds. Seeds that could grow into something much bigger, something that could split the neighborhood in half if left unchecked. And as murmurs rose from the back of the room, I caught the board president glancing at me, not with authority, but with something closer to a silent question. Almost like he was asking, "What do we do now?" His eyes locked on mine, almost pleading without words. The gavel in his hand suddenly looked less like a symbol of power and more like a fragile shield. The board was supposed to lead, but right then they were rattled. And somehow, in that thick silence, I realized the room was waiting, not just for him, not just for Karen, but for me. I hadn't planned on speaking again. I thought my role was finished when her binder collapsed under the weight of outdated bylaws. But now, with neighbors whispering, with Karen painting herself as some kind of revolutionary against an oppressive HOA, I knew if I didn't step in, the narrative would slip. And once it slipped, it wouldn't matter who was right, only who told the better story. So I stood. My chair scraped against the tile, loud enough to hush the room. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't need to. I spoke clearly, steady, like I was speaking to just one person, even though all eyes were on me. Karen says this is about freedom. She says it's about control. But let's be honest. This started because one person decided their convenience mattered more than everyone else's safety. That's not freedom. That's selfishness dressed up as rebellion. A few heads nodded. The tension shifted just slightly. Karen rolled her eyes, but she didn't interrupt. Not yet. I pressed on. She wants you to believe this board is the enemy. But who asked for help when they couldn't leave their driveway? Who asked for rules to be enforced fairly? I did. And the system worked, not because it's perfect but because we all agreed to live by the same standards. If we let one person throw those standards out when it suits them, then the rules don't mean anything. And if the rules don't mean anything, what's left? Chaos. Division. Exactly what she's trying to create right now. The murmurs grew louder, not hostile this time but thoughtful. Some neighbors leaned forward, listening. Others exchanged glances, weighing the words. I could feel the momentum shifting again, like the tide retreating from the shore she had just flooded. Karen laughed sharply, trying to cut through the moment. Oh, listen to him, Mr. Perfect Citizen, preaching about rules like he's the neighborhood saint. Don't kid yourselves, he's just as power-hungry as the rest of them. He wants control. That's all this is. But her voice cracked on the last sentence. Not much, just enough for people to hear the strain behind the anger. And that tiny crack did more damage to her argument than anything I'd said. The board president seized the opening. He tapped the gavel twice and announced they would move into deliberation. Karen shouted protests, but her words were drowned by the shuffle of papers, the scrape of chairs, the sudden buzz of conversation rising from the crowd. For the first time that night, she wasn't the center of gravity. Yet as the board filed out, I caught Karen staring at me, not with rage but with something colder, sharper. A silent promise. She wasn't finished. And deep down, I knew the real battle wasn't going to be fought in that meeting room at all. Because when the board returned with their decision, whatever it was, Karen was already planning her next move, and something in my gut told me it was going to hit harder and wider than a blocked driveway ever could. The board stepped back in after what felt like an hour but was really only 15 minutes. Their expressions told the story before a single word was spoken. The president adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and announced the decision. Karen would be fined heavily, placed on immediate probation, and stripped of her HOA voting rights until further notice. The room reacted in a low ripple, half relief, half disbelief. Some neighbors clapped under their breath, others stayed silent, and a few shot wary glances at Karen as if waiting for her to explode. But she didn't. Not this time. She just sat there, her jaw tight, her hands gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. It was unsettling. Karen thrived on confrontation, but now she was silent, calculating. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head. And when she finally looked up, her eyes weren't fiery, they were icy. That was worse. She stood slowly, deliberately, and spoke in a voice so calm it was almost chilling. Find me. Strip my rights. Call me the problem. But remember this, actions have consequences. For everyone. No shouting, no binder slamming. Just a quiet exit as she gathered her papers and walked out, each step echoing like a warning down the hall. The door shut behind her, and the tension she left behind hung heavier than her presence ever had. Neighbors exhaled, some relieved it was over, others uneasy because it didn't feel over. The board president tried to move on to the next agenda item, but nobody cared about landscaping budgets or community pool schedules anymore. The meeting dissolved into hushed conversations. People packed up quickly, glancing toward the exit as if Karen might reappear at any second. I left with the same thought gnawing at me. Silence from someone like Karen wasn't peace, it was strategy. And I was right. The very next morning, before sunrise, I stepped outside to grab the paper and froze. A single white envelope was tucked under my windshield wiper. No address. No stamp. Just my name, written in tight, angry handwriting I recognized instantly. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No words. Just a printed screenshot, an online form for submitting complaints to the local news station. And at the bottom, circled in red, the submit button. Karen hadn't just hinted at going public. She was showing me she already had the ammunition locked and loaded. And as I stood there on my driveway holding that paper in the early morning quiet, I realized this was no longer about HOA meetings or fines. Karen was moving the fight to a place where rules, bylaws, and votes wouldn't protect anyone. She was about to make it a war of perception. And in that kind of war, facts don't always win. Stories do. And she had just declared she was ready to tell one. I stared at that circled red button like it was a ticking time bomb. The kind of thing that could blow up not just my driveway, not just my reputation, but the entire neighborhood's sense of peace. Karen didn't even need to press it yet. The threat was enough to put everyone on edge. I folded the paper back into the envelope, my mind racing. Should I confront her? No, that's what she wanted, another outburst to twist into her narrative. Should I warn the board? Probably, but I already knew how that would go. Half of them would panic, the other half would dismiss it as an empty bluff. But I knew Karen too well by now. She wasn't bluffing. Not this time. By noon, the rumors had already started spreading. A neighbor at the end of the cul-de-sac mentioned hearing something about the news getting involved. Another whispered that Karen was collecting stories from people, trying to convince them to speak out against the HOA. She was building her case, brick by brick, but not in the way the board could dismantle. This wasn't legal, it was psychological. Later that day, I saw her outside, watering her lawn like nothing had happened. She glanced up, caught my eye, and smiled. Not the smug, mocking grin she usually wore, but something worse. Calm. Patient. The kind of smile that said, I've already set things in motion and you can't stop it. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying her words at the meeting, the way she turned the crowd, the way she planted doubt. If she really went to the press, even a slanted half-truth could paint us all as villains. And me? I'd be the centerpiece of her story, the neighbor who had her car disappeared. The next morning I made a decision. If Karen wanted to play in the court of public opinion, then I had to be ready before she pulled the trigger. So I started gathering my own evidence, again. Not just parking photos this time, but every notice, every record, every message between me, the HOA, and her. I wasn't building a binder, I was building a shield. Because if she dragged us into the light, I needed more than my word to stand on. But then came the twist I didn't expect. As I was organizing everything, I got a knock at the door. A neighbor, one who had stayed quiet through the entire drama, stood on my porch looking uneasy. They leaned in, lowered their voice, and said, "She came to me last night. She's not just talking about the news. She's threatening lawsuits. And she's trying to get people to side with her, against you." My stomach sank. Karen wasn't aiming at the HOA anymore. She was aiming at me directly, trying to isolate me, to turn my neighbors into her allies. And from the look in that neighbor's eyes, I realized something terrifying. She might already have her first recruit. My neighbor's words hit like a cold draft. Recruit one and the whole thing tips. I thanked them, closed the door, and for the first time felt the fight shift from policy to people. Karen's strategy is simple and effective. Isolate the target, amplify the outrage, then let momentum and emotion do the rest. If she convinces enough folks that the HOA is an invading force, facts become background noise. I started reaching out. Not publicly, not with drama, but one message at a time, concise, factual, and impossible to misread. Photos with timestamps. Copies of notices. A timeline that made sense. I asked for two things only, truth and perspective. Some neighbors replied with silent thumbs up. A couple sent back their own photos. One older man who rarely left his porch wrote 3 paragraphs and ended with, "Finally, someone did something." The quiet ones mattered more than the loud ones. Meanwhile, Karen didn't sit idle. She doubled her charm offensive, offering help with dog walking, bringing pies, and showing up at the mailbox with a friendly wave. To anyone watching from the outside, she looked like a concerned resident who'd been wronged. To those who'd seen the months of warnings and the old tone notice she'd ignored, it was theater. I realized she was trying to make allies out of emotions. Pity, fear, the desire to avoid conflict. All of them faster to spread than simple facts. I called the HOA attorney and asked for a briefing. Not legal advice for me personally, but clarity on what was on record and what would be public if the press sniffed around. He was direct. If this goes public, every documented interaction becomes fair game. He offered to prepare a neutral summary the board could share if reporters came knocking. He also recommended we keep communication channels tight. One spokesperson, one message. Consistency wins when narratives collide. I drafted that message that night. Short, calm, unassailable. It said what happened, why it happened, and what the community intended to do about it. No accusations. No grandstanding. Just facts and an appeal to common sense. I didn't distribute it yet. Control of the first public word felt critical. Whoever defines the story first usually gets to keep the shape of it. The next morning, a local blogger I'd never heard of slid into my DMs. Their subject line read, "Heard you had an interesting HOA situation. Can we talk?" My pulse jumped. Reporters don't knock on inboxes for nothing. I didn't answer with emotion. I answered with availability and boundaries. I would speak only with documented facts with the HOA rep present, and only after reviewing what they intended to publish. That reply bought time and forced a bit of respect. Then came the small sabotage. My garbage can was toppled one evening and a smear of something unidentifiable streaked across the hood of my car. No note. No confession. Just a message and fingerprints. A neighbor saw someone moving away under the streetlight and swore it looked like Karen. I filed a police report because messes like that change the tone of a story fast, from petty to criminal, and I refused to let the narrative mutate on its own. People started whispering that night about escalation and lines crossed. My doorbell app recorded 3 late-night visitors, faces blurred by distance. The HOA offered extra patrols near my house and suggested we keep social media postings factual and restrained. I accepted the help and set up a simple folder of evidence, like a small fortress of paper and pixels. Each new item made my story harder to twist, but it also made the conflict larger, louder, and harder to ignore. A week later, the blogger published a short teaser online, framing the situation as neighborhood feud spirals. Comments poured in, a mix of outrage, mockery, and curiosity. The town reporter called next. The phone felt heavy in my hand. I readied my one-line statement and sent the HOA summary to the reporter first, then asked for questions in writing. She responded quickly, but with one line that made my heart drop. We're running this by noon. I typed a reply, paused, and then hit send, 3 sentences, measured, firm, and hit the call button to the board president before the reporter could finish her next question. On the line, his voice was steady but small. He said, "If this goes national, our lives change." I agreed. I also knew the opposite. If we didn't speak now, we'd cede control. We planned a short press release, a trusted neighbor to record a calm on-camera statement, and a quiet door-to-door update to the cul-de-sac. Every move had to be deliberate, visible, and human. No legalese, no cold documents, just neighbors explaining neighbors. As we moved, Karen escalated in ways that felt almost cinematic. Flyers appeared on cars the next morning with a grainy photo of me and the words "Vigilante" scrawled beneath. Someone posted a doctored screenshot of an email thread, claiming I had coordinated the tow personally. The line between truth and illusion blurred in minutes. My phone buzzed with messages from friends and 2 people offering to help with legal support. Somebody suggested we hold a community live stream to tell our side before the story spun. I hesitated, knowing live moments rarely go exactly as planned, but also knowing that silence could be even more dangerous. I set a time for a short, controlled live stream and assembled 3 people to speak: the board president, the HOA attorney, and myself. We rehearsed talking points until our voices sounded like a chorus, steady, factual, human. We planned to begin with the timeline, show the notices, and answer a few pre-screened questions. We agreed not to engage with provocations. We agreed to show the community as a place that solves problems, not a battlefield. On the morning of the live stream, the street hummed with a nervous electricity. Cars parked at odd angles, neighbors peered from windows, and someone walked by holding a camera like a talisman. My hands shook just enough to be real. We went live, our faces calm, our words practiced, and the chat filled with questions and emojis in equal measure. Midway through, a reporter phoned in with one last curveball. "We've received an anonymous tip alleging the HOA misapplied rules before." The chat froze. The board president's jaw tightened. The attorney advised we acknowledge an inquiry and commit to transparency. I could feel the momentum teetering. As the chat scrolled faster than my eyes could read, a notification popped up on my phone. A video was trending in the local group, grainy, from across the street, shot at dusk. The clip showed a car door open, a figure moving swiftly, and a flash of something white. The caption read, "Caught on camera, was he planting evidence?" My throat tightened. The image was ambiguous, but the implication was explosive. I swallowed, stood up, and picked up the one phone call I had hoped I wouldn't have to make. And that's where I'll leave it for now. Because what started as a blocked driveway had spiraled into something bigger, bigger than cars, bigger than fines, bigger even than the HOA itself. It became a battle of perception, of neighbors versus neighbors, of truth versus whatever story Karen decided to spin next. If you've been watching this unfold with me, you know this is far from the end. Karen isn't done, and honestly neither am I. But that's the lesson here. Sometimes the real fight isn't in the rules or the paperwork, it's in the narrative, in who controls the story. So stick around, because what happens next is going to decide whether this neighborhood holds together, or completely comes apart. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter in this saga. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this plays out.